They were told American soldiers would do unspeakable things to captured women. That surrender meant a fate worse than death. But when Haruka Tanaka, a 23-year-old Japanese nurse, was pulled from the holding area on Okinawa in July 1945, her fellow prisoners began to scream. 2 American soldiers were leading her toward a tent marked with crosses and stars, and the other women knew what this meant. They had been warned since childhood. Officers, violation, shame beyond repair. They clutched the wire fence, their voices rising in desperate protest. But Haruka did not scream. She walked in silence, her heart pounding like artillery fire, her mind preparing for the worst. What she found inside that tent would shatter everything she had been taught about the enemy. Not violence, not degradation, but something far more dangerous to her understanding of the world. A grey-haired man in uniform holding a Bible, a cup of tea, and an interpreter who spoke her language with gentleness. They called him the Chaplain, and what he offered her would prove more devastating to her beliefs than any weapon. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II that challenged everything you thought you knew, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let's go back to that moment on Okinawa where everything Haruka believed was about to change. The island of Okinawa in the summer of 1945 was a landscape of absolute destruction. Where once there had been villages with tile-roofed houses and terraced rice fields, now there was only mud shell craters and the skeletal remains of buildings. The Battle of Okinawa had ended just weeks before, leaving behind a graveyard of shattered concrete, twisted metal, and memories too dark to speak aloud. The smell of death still hung in the humid air, mixing with the salt of the ocean and the smoke of fires that never quite went out. In a makeshift holding area, near what remained of Naha, a group of Japanese women sat huddled together in the shade of canvas tarps. They were nurses' clerks and civilian volunteers who had been swept up in the final desperate days of the battle. Some wore the remnants of their white nurse uniforms, now grey with dirt and stained with blood that had turned brown in the tropical heat. Others wore simple peasant clothing, torn and muddy from weeks of hiding in caves. Their faces were hollow, their eyes distant, their bodies weak from weeks of drinking rainwater and eating whatever they could find in the ruins. There were 23 women in this particular group. The youngest was Michiko, just 19 years old, with the kind of innocent face that made everyone want to protect her. The oldest was a former schoolteacher named Keiko, perhaps 35, though the war had aged them all beyond their years. They sat in silence, mostly speaking only in whispers when they spoke at all. The American soldiers who guarded them were not cruel, but their presence was a constant reminder of defeat, of capture, of shame that cut deeper than any physical wound. The women had been taught from childhood that to be taken prisoner by the enemy was the ultimate dishonor. Death was preferable. Surrender was unthinkable. Yet here they were, alive prisoners, and every moment of continued existence felt like a betrayal of everything they had been raised to believe. Each breath was an act of cowardice. Each meal they accepted from American hands was proof of their weakness. Haruka sat near the edge of the group, her back against a wooden post that had somehow survived the bombardment. She was 23 years old, though she felt ancient. Before the war consumed everything, she had been training as a nurse in Osaka, dreaming of a quiet life helping others, perhaps working in a children's hospital or a rural clinic where she could make a real difference. Her father was a carpenter who built beautiful things with his hands. Her mother sewed clothes for neighbors and sang while she worked. Her older brother, Takeshi, had been the pride of the family, strong and kind, always looking out for his sisters. Then came the call to serve the emperor, the promise that her skills were needed for the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. She had believed it all. She had volunteered, proudly boarded the ship to Okinawa, with a heart full of duty and purpose, with her mother's hand-embroidered handkerchief tucked into her pocket as a reminder of home. Now that purpose lay in ruins around her, buried under the rubble of hospitals and the bodies of patients she could not save. The hospital where she had worked was nothing but broken concrete and twisted rebar. The patients she had tended were dead or scattered to the winds. The other nurses she had trained with were mostly gone, buried in collapsed caves or lost in the chaos of retreat. She had survived by hiding in a tomb, drinking from puddles, eating grass when there was nothing else, and holding a small knife against her own throat every night, promising herself she would use it before she let the Americans take her alive. And then the Americans had found her, pulled her from her hiding place with rough hands and incomprehensible shouts. She had closed her eyes and waited for the bullet or the bayonet, but instead they had given her water. Actual clean water in a canteen that she drank so fast she vomited it back up. They had fed her a strange meal of canned meat and crackers that tasted like cardboard but filled her stomach for the first time in weeks. They had allowed her to wash her face with real soap. Then they had brought her to this holding area with the other women and simply left them there, guarded but not harmed, waiting for something none of them understood. The other women whispered theories in the darkness. They would be transported to America as slaves, forced to work in factories or fields until they died. They would be used for medical experiments like the stories they had heard about what Japanese doctors did to prisoners in Manchuria, only now the tables would be turned. They would be executed once there were enough of them to make it efficient, lined up and shot, like the stories said Americans did to prisoners in Europe. Each theory was darker than the last, and no one had the strength to argue or offer hope. They could only wait, watching the American soldiers move about the camp with their strange efficiency, their casual attitudes, their incomprehensible language that sounded harsh and guttural to ears trained on Japanese. It was late afternoon when the two soldiers approached their holding area. The women tensed immediately, drawing closer together like schooling fish, sensing a predator in the water. One of the soldiers, a young man with red hair and freckles that stood out even in the fading light, carried a clipboard with papers attached. The other, older and harder looking, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much combat, had a rifle slung over his shoulder, but carried it casually, not at the ready. They stopped at the entrance to the fenced area and began speaking to the guard on duty. The women could not understand the words, but they understood body language, and they understood the gesture when the young soldier with red hair pointed directly at Haruka. Her stomach dropped. Her hands began to shake. The small knife she had hidden in her clothing was gone, confiscated when she was first captured, and now she had nothing. No way to escape what was coming, no way to preserve her honor in the way she had been taught. The other women noticed immediately. Their eyes widened with recognition and fear. This was it. This was the moment when the Americans would show their true nature, when all the lies they had been fed would be proven right, when the nightmare they had been promised would finally begin. The guard opened the gate. The two soldiers entered. The young one with the clipboard walked directly toward Haruka, his boots crunching on the gravel in a rhythm that sounded like a death march. The other women began to cry out, their voices rising in protest that grew louder with each step the soldiers took. An older woman grabbed Haruka's arm, trying to hold her back, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. Another shouted something in Japanese, begging the soldiers to take her, instead offering herself as a sacrifice. But the Americans did not understand or did not care. The young soldier with red hair reached out his hand toward Haruka, gesturing for her to stand. Not grabbing, not forcing, just gesturing. But his meaning was clear. She had no choice. Haruka stood on trembling legs that barely supported her weight. Her body was weak, her spirit weaker. Resistance would mean violence, and she was too exhausted, too depleted to fight. The women around her were screaming now, some in anger, some in despair, some in that particular kind of anguish that comes from watching something terrible happen and being powerless to stop it. They knew where she was being taken. They knew what would happen. Every story they had ever heard, every warning they had ever been given, every piece of indoctrination they had absorbed since childhood was coming true before their eyes. As the soldiers led Haruka away from the group, she heard one woman scream the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Keiko, the former schoolteacher with the hard eyes and harder convictions, screamed it loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're taking her to the officers' tent. They're taking her to the officers." The voice was raw with anguish, with helpless rage, with the knowledge of what officers did to captured women. And Haruka, walking between the two American soldiers, her legs barely able to carry her forward, believed it was true. Every muscle in her body tensed. Every instinct told her to run, to fight, to die, rather than endure what was coming. But she walked on, because what choice did she have? Death would come, whether she walked or was dragged, and at least walking preserved some small shred of dignity in these final moments. The walk from the holding area to the tent felt endless, though it could not have been more than 200 yards. Haruka walked between the two soldiers, her eyes fixed on the ground, counting her steps, because counting gave her something to focus on besides the terror. Her mind raced through everything she had been taught about maintaining dignity in the face of ultimate shame. She thought of her mother, her father, her dead brother, Takeshi, and the dishonor she was about to bring upon their memory. She thought of the small knife she no longer had, and wished desperately that she still had it. She thought of the ocean visible in the distance between the tents, and how she would never see it again after this day. The American camp spread out around them in organized chaos. Tents arranged in neat rows like a geometric puzzle. Vehicles parked in formation. Soldiers moving with purpose, carrying supplies, talking in their rough foreign language, smoking cigarettes, and laughing about something she could not understand. None of them paid particular attention to the Japanese woman being escorted through their midst. To them, she was just another prisoner, another piece of the war's aftermath to be processed and dealt with according to regulations and procedures. But to Haruka, every step was agony. Every American face she passed could be the one who would hurt her. Every tent they walked by could be the place where her worst fears would come true. She tried to make herself small, invisible, though she knew it was pointless. She had been chosen, selected for whatever came next. There was no escape now, no miracle coming, just the tent ahead with its mysterious symbols and whatever horrors waited inside. They passed a medical tent where wounded soldiers lay on cots, some smoking cigarettes, others reading letters from home, a few with bandages covering terrible injuries that made Haruka's medical training want to assess and treat even through her fear. They passed a supply area where men unloaded crates from trucks. The smell of gasoline and oil mixing with something else, something that made her stomach twist with an emotion she could not name. They passed what looked like a mess hall, where the smell of cooking food drifted out on the humid air, and that smell was so foreign, so different from anything she had eaten in months, that it took her a moment to recognize it as food at all. And then finally, they arrived at a tent that stood slightly apart from the others. The tent was marked with symbols Haruka did not understand. A cross which she recognized vaguely as Christian. A six-pointed star she had never seen before. Some kind of crescent moon that meant nothing to her. The symbols of religions that were not her own, that belonged to the enemy, that marked this place as something different from the other tents around it. The young soldier with the clipboard gestured for her to wait, then disappeared inside the tent, leaving her standing there with the older soldier who said nothing. The man simply stood there watching the horizon with the bored expression of someone performing a routine duty he had done 1,000 times before. He did not look at her with hatred or lust or any of the emotions she had been taught to expect. He just looked tired as she felt, and somehow that was more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Haruka's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Her hands were ice cold, despite the tropical heat that made sweat run down her back and soak into her filthy uniform. She could feel every beat of her pulse in her throat, in her temples, in her wrists. This was it. This was the moment. In seconds, she would know the full horror of what the enemy did to captured women. In seconds, her life as she knew it would end. She closed her eyes and tried to remember a prayer her grandmother had taught her when she was small. Something about ancestors and protection, about the spirits of family watching over you in times of danger. But the words would not come. Only fear remained pure and absolute, filling every space in her mind until there was room for nothing else. The young soldier emerged from the tent and gestured for Haruka to enter. She hesitated, her body refusing to obey, even though her mind knew there was no choice. The soldier's expression was neutral, patient, almost gentle, in a way that confused her. He gestured again, more gently this time, and made a sound in English that might have been meant to be reassuring. The older soldier gave her a light nudge on the shoulder. Not rough, not violent, just enough to break through her paralysis and get her moving. She took one step forward, then another, and then she was at the entrance to the tent, her hand reaching out to pull back the canvas flap, her whole body trembling as she stepped into the unknown. The interior of the tent was dim after the bright sunlight outside. It took a moment for Haruka's eyes to adjust to the change, a moment where she stood frozen just inside the entrance, blind and vulnerable, and waiting for hands to grab her. When her vision cleared, she saw something completely unexpected, something so different from what she had prepared herself for, that her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The tent was set up like a small office or meeting space. There was a folding table in the center, several chairs arranged around it, a makeshift bookshelf against one wall, filled with worn volumes that looked like they had been read many times. On the table sat a teapot, an actual ceramic teapot, painted with delicate flowers, and 2 cups waiting to be filled. And behind the table stood a man in an American uniform, but not like the others she had seen. He was older, perhaps 60, with grey hair that was neatly combed and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His uniform was neat, but worn clearly, not new, and on his collar were insignia that Haruka did not recognize, but that seemed different from the other soldiers. There was something about his posture, about the way he held himself, that suggested authority without aggression, command without threat. Standing next to him was a woman in a simple dress, clearly Asian, possibly Japanese or Chinese, with kind features and an expression of deep sympathy. When she saw Haruka enter, when she saw the terror written across the young nurse's face, the woman spoke in perfect Japanese. "Please do not be afraid. You are safe here. My name is Yuki Nakamura. I am an interpreter. This is Chaplain Reverend Samuel Miller. He asked to speak with you because he heard you might need someone to talk to." "Please sit down." Haruka stood frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. The woman's Japanese was fluent, educated, gentle-spoken with the accent of someone from the Kansai region around Osaka. The words made no sense in the context of where she was and what she had expected. Safe. Talk. Need someone. These were not the words of captors preparing to violate a prisoner. She looked from the woman to the chaplain, searching for signs of the violence she had been expecting, but the chaplain merely smiled. It was a grandfatherly smile, warm and genuine, and he gestured to one of the chairs with a movement that was invitation rather than command. "Please," Yuki said again, her voice soft and reassuring. "The chaplain means you no harm. He is a man of God. He helps all prisoners regardless of their faith or nationality. He wanted to offer you tea and to ask if there is anything you need. That is all. Just tea and conversation if you wish it." Haruka's legs, already weak from malnutrition and fear, began to buckle. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her hands leaving prints on the polished wood. Yuki moved quickly to help her into a chair, speaking softly in Japanese, all the while reassuring her, telling her to breathe, that everything would be all right. The chaplain remained where he was, maintaining a respectful distance, his expression filled with concern rather than threat. "Water," the chaplain said in English, and Yuki immediately poured a cup from a pitcher on the side table. Haruka took it with shaking hands, the cup rattling against her teeth as she brought it to her lips. The water was cool and clean, shocking her parched throat, and she had not realized how thirsty she was until that first swallow. When she finished, Yuki refilled the cup without being asked, and Haruka drank again, slower this time, her mind beginning to work again as her body received what it desperately needed. The chaplain began to speak, his voice low and calm, and Yuki translated his words into Japanese with the skill of someone who had done this many times before. "I know you must be very frightened. I know you have been through terrible things. The battle here was one of the worst of the war, and I cannot imagine what you have endured. But I want you to know that while you are in American custody, you will be treated with respect and dignity. You will not be harmed. You will be given food, water, medical care if you need it, and a safe place to rest." Haruka listened, but did not respond. She could not trust this. It had to be a trick, a way to make her lower her guard before the real horror began. The systematic deception had been too thorough, too detailed, too specific about what Americans did to captured women. This kindness had to be a mask for something worse. The chaplain seemed to understand her silence. He continued speaking, his tone never changing from that gentle, patient rhythm. "I am a chaplain. Do you know what that means? I am a religious leader, like a priest or a monk. My job is to care for the spiritual needs of soldiers and prisoners. I do not fight. I do not interrogate. I only offer comfort if people want it. I have spoken with many prisoners since we arrived here, Japanese soldiers and civilians. Some want to talk, some want to sit in silence, some want to pray. Whatever you need, I am here to provide it if you wish." Haruka's mind struggled to comprehend this. A religious leader in the American military. She had never heard of such a thing. In Japan, religion and military service were separate spheres that did not intersect. Monks and priests did not wear uniforms. They did not serve on battlefields. The idea seemed absurd, impossible, yet another piece of evidence that the world she thought she understood had been turned upside down. Yuki must have seen the confusion on her face. She spoke again, her voice gentle and patient. "It is true. In America, chaplains are part of the military. They represent different faiths, Christian, Jewish, and others. They are there to help soldiers keep their faith during war and to offer comfort to prisoners of all religions. Chaplain Miller has been doing this for 20 years. He has helped many people." The chaplain reached for the teapot and poured tea into the 2 cups on the table, the liquid steaming gently in the dim light of the tent. He pushed 1 cup across the table toward Haruka with a movement so simple and ordinary that it shocked her more than any violence could have. The smell that rose from the cup was familiar, achingly familiar, impossibly familiar. Green tea. Real green tea, not the bitter substitute she had been drinking for years. The smell of home, of her mother's kitchen, of normalcy and peace, and a world that no longer existed. Her eyes filled with tears at the simple, impossible kindness of it. "I know you probably have questions," the chaplain said through Yuki's translation. "Perhaps you are wondering why you were brought here. The truth is, one of the guards noticed that you seemed particularly distressed, more so than the other women. He mentioned it to me, and I thought you might benefit from speaking with someone in your own language in a safe space. That is all this is. A safe space. You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to. You do not have to believe anything I say. But you are welcome to rest here for a little while, drink your tea, and know that for this moment you are safe." Haruka picked up the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She brought it to her lips and took a sip, and the taste exploded on her tongue like a memory made physical. Real green tea, properly prepared with just a hint of sweetness. It was the taste of home, of normalcy, of a world before war. And she could not stop the tears that began to fall, could not stop them any more than she could stop breathing. Yuki reached across the table and placed a handkerchief in front of her, white and clean and smelling faintly of soap. "It is all right to cry. You have held so much inside for so long." And Haruka, who had not cried since the day she was captured, who had kept herself frozen and numb through weeks of horror because crying meant acknowledging what had happened, and she was not ready to acknowledge it, finally broke. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside her, tearing their way out in great shuddering waves that shook her whole body. She cried for the patients she had lost, for the friends who had died in the caves, for her family, who she would probably never see again. She cried for the shame of capture and the relief of survival. She cried for the confusion of this moment, this impossible kindness from the enemy she had been taught to hate and fear above all things. The chaplain and Yuki said nothing. They simply let her cry, let her release the pressure that had been building inside her for so long, let her be human in a way she had not been allowed to be since the battle began. When the sobs finally subsided into hiccups and then silence, Yuki handed her another handkerchief. "Better?" she asked gently. Haruka nodded, unable to speak, her throat raw from crying. The chaplain spoke again, and Yuki translated. I want to tell you something important. The Geneva Convention, which is an international agreement about how prisoners of war must be treated, requires that all prisoners be treated humanely. They must be fed, housed, and cared for. They must not be tortured or abused. They must be allowed to practice their religion if they wish. These are not just American rules. These are rules that civilized nations agree to follow, and we take them very seriously. Haruka finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. But we were told. They said Americans would. She could not finish the sentence. The words were too shameful to speak aloud, too terrible to give voice to in this gentle space with these kind people. Yuki's face filled with understanding and sadness. I know what you were told. I know the stories they spread. They are lies, designed to make you afraid, to make you fight harder, to make you choose death over surrender. I know because I heard the same lies when I was young. She waited until Haruka met her eyes. Look at me. I am Japanese. I was born in California to Japanese parents. When the war started, my family was sent to an internment camp. It was wrong and it was hard, but we were not killed. We were not tortured. And now I work here helping to translate, helping prisoners like you understand that you are not in danger, the chaplain added, and Yuki translated his words with careful precision. You will see in the days to come that what we tell you is true. You will be moved to a proper prisoner of war camp. You will have barracks to sleep in, food to eat, medical care when you need it. You will be able to write letters to your family if you wish, and they can write to you. You will be given work to do, but it will be fair work, and you will be treated as human beings, not as the enemy, as people who deserve dignity and respect. Haruka stared down at her teacup, her mind reeling. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed was being challenged in this moment. The Americans were supposed to be demons, brutal and savage, without honor or humanity. Yet here she sat, drinking tea, being spoken to with kindness, being offered comfort instead of violence. It made no sense. The world had turned upside down, and she did not know which way was up anymore. Every certainty she had clung to was dissolving like sugar in hot tea, and she did not know what would be left when the dissolution was complete. When Haruka was escorted back to the holding area an hour later, the other women stared at her in shocked silence. She was alive. She was walking. She did not appear injured or disheveled. In fact, she looked calmer than when she had left, though her eyes were red from crying. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and it terrified them more than screams would have. The women crowded around her immediately, their questions tumbling over each other in rapid Japanese voices, rising with anxiety and confusion and desperate need to understand. What did they do to you? Are you hurt? Did they question you? Why did they let you come back? Haruka sat down slowly on the ground, still processing what had happened, her mind struggling to reconcile the indoctrination she had believed for years with the reality she had just experienced. She looked at the worried, fearful faces around her and tried to find words that would make sense. But how could she explain something she did not understand herself? They gave me tea, she said, finally, her voice quiet but steady. The chaplain gave me tea and talked to me about the Geneva Convention. The women stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Keiko, the former schoolteacher with the hard face and harder convictions, frowned deeply, her expression mixing disbelief with something that might have been anger. What do you mean, tea? What chaplain? You were taken to the officers' tent. No. Haruka, said her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Not officers. A chaplain. A religious leader. He had an interpreter, a Japanese woman from America. They wanted to make sure I was all right. They told me we would be treated according to international law. They said we would not be harmed. Silence fell over the group like a heavy blanket. The women exchanged glances, uncertain whether to believe this or whether Haruka had lost her mind from trauma. The youngest girl, Michiko, barely 19, with the face of a child, spoke up hesitantly. But teacher told us the Americans were barbarians, that they would. She could not finish, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at what she had been about to say. Haruka met her eyes with a directness that surprised them both. "I know what we were told. I believed it too, but it was not true. At least not what happened to me today. They were kind. They gave me water and tea and let me cry and told me I would be safe." She paused, then added quietly, "I do not understand it either, but that is what happened." Keiko shook her head slowly, her jaw tight with tension. It could be a trick to make us trust them, to make us cooperate. Perhaps Haruka agreed, unwilling to argue, but also unwilling to dismiss what she had experienced. But if it is a trick, it is a very elaborate one. Why would they waste good tea and an interpreter's time just to deceive one frightened nurse? No one had an answer to that, and the silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of shared fear, but the silence of shared confusion, of certainty beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. That evening, the women were moved to a larger tent with canvas cots and given their first proper meal as American prisoners. The food arrived on metal trays carried by soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave boys with smooth faces and nervous smiles, who set down the trays and left quickly, as if uncertain how to behave around enemy women who looked more like ghosts than threats. The women approached the table slowly, cautiously, as if the food might bite them or disappear if they moved too fast. On each tray was more food than most of them had seen in months. White rice. Actual white rice, not the mixed grain rations they had been eating for years. A piece of fish grilled and seasoned with salt, and something else they could not identify. Vegetables still green and fresh, not wilted or rotten. A piece of bread, soft and light, still warm from whatever oven had produced it, and a small orange bright as a sunset, perfect and unblemished. Michiko, the youngest, reached out tentatively and picked up the orange. She turned it over in her hands, staring at it as if it were a precious jewel, as if it might vanish if she blinked. "I have not seen an orange since before the war," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother used to buy them for New Year celebrations." The memory seemed to physically pain her, and she clutched the orange to her chest like a talisman. The women stood around the table in silence, each dealing with their own storm of emotions. The food was real, it was abundant, it was being freely given, and it made no sense in the context of everything they had been taught. The enemy was supposed to starve prisoners, not feed them oranges. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, not generous. Every piece of food on these trays was another crack in the foundation of their understanding. Finally, hunger won out over confusion. One by one, the women took their trays and sat down to eat. The first bites were cautious testing for poison or tampering, but the food was good. Simple and nourishing, and more than their shrunken stomachs could handle all at once. Soon they were eating with the desperate intensity of people who had been starving for too long, and some ate in silence while tears streamed down their faces. Others ate mechanically, their minds clearly elsewhere, perhaps with family members who had no food at all. Haruka ate slowly, tasting each mouthful, trying to reconcile this reality with the lies that had filled her head for years. The fish was perfectly cooked. The rice was the best she had tasted since leaving Osaka. The orange, when she finally peeled it, released a burst of fragrance so intense it made her dizzy with memory. When they finished eating, there was food left over. This shocked them almost more than anything else. In Japan, in the military, in the hospitals, every grain of rice was precious. Waste was unthinkable, a sin against the collective effort. Yet here was food remaining on the serving plates, food that would apparently be thrown away or given to someone else. The contrast was staggering, almost obscene in its abundance. That night, lying on a real cot with a real pillow for the first time in weeks, Haruka stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and tried to make sense of her new reality. The other women were quiet, but she could tell from their breathing that most of them were awake, probably wrestling with the same questions that plagued her. Who were these Americans who fed their enemies so well? What did they want? And most troubling of all, what if everything they had been taught was wrong? Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself, and routine brought a strange kind of comfort even in captivity. The women were woken each morning by the same soldier, the young man they privately nicknamed Red because of his auburn hair that caught fire in the morning sun. He would call out in English, his voice gentle despite the foreign harshness of the language, then wait politely outside while they dressed. This small act of respect, this acknowledgement of their privacy and dignity, was itself a kind of revolution. Red would then escort them to the washing area, which was just a row of outdoor sinks with running water. But to women who had been living in caves, it was luxury beyond measure. Clean water that came from a tap instead of a muddy puddle, soap that actually created lather, towels that were rough but clean. Haruka looked at herself in a cracked mirror one morning and barely recognized the face that looked back. Thin, yes. Haunted, certainly. But clean. Alive. After washing came breakfast, and breakfast brought daily revelations. Rice porridge, sometimes with dried fish mixed in. Toast with margarine that tasted nothing like butter but was rich and satisfying nonetheless. And coffee. Always coffee. The coffee tasted strange and bitter to most of them. At first nothing like the tea they had grown up drinking, but they drank it anyway because it was hot, and it was there, and it contained a kind of energy they desperately needed. Some of the women began to develop a taste for it, though they would never have admitted, it would never have acknowledged that they were beginning to prefer this American drink to their own tea. Haruka found herself craving it each morning, found herself disappointed on the rare occasions when coffee was not available. This small betrayal of cultural preference troubled her more than it should have. After breakfast came work assignments. The women were sorted into groups and given various tasks, none of them difficult, none of them degrading. Some were assigned to help in the camp laundry, washing uniforms and linens in great vats of hot, soapy water. Others helped in the kitchen, peeling vegetables and preparing food under the supervision of American cooks who communicated through gestures and broken phrases. A few with medical training, including Haruka, and another nurse named Akari, were eventually assigned to assist in the camp's aid station, helping to care for sick or injured prisoners, both Japanese and occasionally American soldiers, with minor ailments. The work was not hard, not compared to what they had endured during the battle. They were given breaks. They were allowed water whenever they needed it. They were never shouted at or struck. The American supervisors communicated through gestures and a few Japanese words they had learned, and while the language barrier was frustrating, it was not hostile. There was no cruelty in it, no deliberate humiliation. Haruka found herself working alongside an American medic named Frank, a lanky man from somewhere called Nebraska, who seemed to find the whole situation awkward, but tried his best to be friendly. He taught her English words with the patience of a good teacher. Bandage, scissors, water, please, thank you. Simple words that became bridges between two people who had been taught they were supposed to be enemies. She taught him Japanese phrases in return, stumbling through the pronunciation corrections while he mangled the sounds in ways that made her want to laugh despite everything. His attempts at saying bandage in Japanese came out so wrong that she actually did laugh once, a sound that surprised them both, and he had grinned at her with genuine pleasure, pointing to himself and saying terrible with an exaggerated grimace that made it clear he knew exactly how bad his pronunciation was. She found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, and that smile felt like a betrayal of everything she was supposed to be. One afternoon, Frank showed her a photograph he kept in his breast pocket, protected in a small leather case worn smooth from constant handling. A pretty blonde woman holding a chubby infant, both smiling at the camera with the kind of happiness that seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Helen," he said, pointing to the woman with a tenderness that transcended language. "And Emma." He smiled with such obvious love and longing that Haruka felt a pain in her chest, sharp and unexpected. This man was not a faceless enemy. He was a husband and father far from home, missing his family, carrying their photograph next to his heart. Just like Japanese soldiers had done, just like her brother Takeshi had done before he died in the Philippines. The realization was uncomfortable, even dangerous, because it meant seeing the enemy as human, and seeing the enemy as human made everything infinitely more complicated than the simple narratives allowed. It meant that the world was not divided into good and evil, us and them, but was instead full of people trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. In the third week of their captivity, the women were told through Yuki the interpreter that they would be allowed to write letters to their families. The letters would be read by censors to ensure they contained no military information, but otherwise the women were free to tell their families that they were alive and safe. Additionally, if any letters came for them through the Red Cross, those would be delivered. The announcement created a storm of emotion that swept through the tent like a physical force. Some women wept with relief at the possibility of contacting their families, of letting mothers and fathers know that their daughters still lived. Others worried about what to say, how to explain that they had surrendered, that they were prisoners. The shame was still there, woven so deeply into their understanding of honor that even kindness could not completely erase it. Haruka wrote her letter over the course of 2 days, crossing out and rewriting sentences, trying to find the right words. How could she tell her mother that she was alive without revealing how she was being treated? If she told the truth that the Americans fed her well, treated her with respect, gave her work and rest, and even books to read, would her mother believe it? Or would she think Haruka had been brainwashed, turned against her own people? The indoctrination had been so complete, so pervasive, that the truth itself had become unbelievable. In the end, she kept it simple. Dear Mother, I am alive and unharmed. I think of you and Father and the family every day. I hope you are well. Please do not worry about me. I am being cared for. Your daughter Haruka. She folded the letter carefully and gave it to the American soldier, collecting them, wondering if it would ever reach Osaka, wondering if her mother was even still alive to receive it. The not knowing was perhaps worse than any certainty could have been. 3 weeks later, a response came. The thin envelope marked with Red Cross symbols was handed to her by Yuki with a gentle smile that suggested she knew what the letter would contain, had perhaps read hundreds of similar letters from other families. Haruka took it with shaking hands and sat down on her cot before opening it, needing the support beneath her because she knew her legs would not hold. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her mother's familiar handwriting, and even before she read the words, the sight of those careful characters made her weep. My dear Haruka, we received your letter and wept with joy to know you are alive. We had heard that Okinawa had fallen and feared the worst. Your father is not well. His cough has gotten worse without medicine. Food is very scarce now. We are eating whatever we can find. Your brother Takeshi was killed in the Philippines last year. We only learned this month. Your sister Ayame works in a factory now making airplane parts. She is very thin. The city was bombed again last week. Our neighborhood is mostly gone, but we are alive. And now we know you are alive, and that is enough. Do not feel shame about your situation. Survival is not shameful. We love you and pray for you every day. Mother. Haruka read the letter 3 times, then pressed it against her chest and wept. Her brother was dead. Her father was sick. Her family was starving while she ate rice and fish and oranges. The guilt crashed over her like a wave, threatening to pull her under and never let her surface again. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, their own news from home, their own accounts of suffering and destruction. The tent filled with the sound of quiet crying, a chorus of grief that seemed to seep into the canvas walls and become part of the structure itself. Akari, the nurse from Nagasaki, sat on her cot, staring at her letter with eyes that had gone empty. My family was near the city center, she whispered to no one in particular. There was a new bomb. Something different. The whole city. Everyone. The words hung in the air like smoke. That evening, as they sat picking at their dinner, a meal that suddenly felt obscene in its abundance, Keiko spoke the words they were all thinking. They are starving, she said quietly, her voice flat with a kind of controlled rage. Our families, our people, they are starving and sick and dying. And we are here eating food we do not deserve, living in comfort we have not earned. She looked around at the other women, her eyes hard. How can we accept this kindness from the enemy while our families starve because of them? Michiko's voice was defensive, almost pleading. We did not ask for this. We did not choose to be captured. No, Keiko agreed, her jaw tight. But we are here nonetheless. And every meal we eat, every night we sleep in safety, Our people suffer." She paused, then added with terrible precision, "We eat while our mothers eat grass. We sleep while our fathers die without medicine." Haruka set down her chopsticks, the food turning to ash in her mouth. She had been thinking the same thing, wrestling with the same guilt, but Keiko's words brought it into sharp focus. "The Americans did not make our families starve," Haruka said slowly, working through the thought even as she spoke it. "The war did that. The decisions of our leaders did that. The Americans bomb our cities because our military attacked them first, because our leaders chose war. The suffering at home is terrible. But it is not because these soldiers here want us to suffer. It is because war itself is suffering." Keiko stared at her, and in that stare was something close to betrayal. "Are you defending them?" "Defending the enemy?" "No," Haruka said firmly. "I am trying to understand. We were told the Americans were monsters who would torture us, but they have not. We were told they would violate us and kill us, but they have given us food and medicine and letters from home. Either everything we were told was a lie, or the world is more complicated than we were taught. And I think it is the second one." The argument might have continued, might have escalated into something uglier, but at that moment, Red appeared at the entrance to their tent, carrying a wooden crate. He set it down with a grunt and gestured for them to look inside, his freckled face breaking into a smile that seemed genuine despite the language barrier. The women approached cautiously and peered into the crate. Inside were books, Japanese books, novels and poetry collections, and even a few magazines from before the war, their pages yellowed but intact. There were also some games, a shogi board with all its pieces, playing cards, paper and pencils for writing or drawing. Red smiled and said something in English that none of them understood, but his meaning was clear from his gestures and his expression. "These are for you." Then he left, whistling tunelessly as he walked away into the gathering darkness. The women stared at the crate in silence. Finally, Michiko reached in and pulled out a poetry collection. She opened it carefully, as if it might crumble at her touch, and began to read aloud. Her voice was soft and hesitant at first, but grew stronger as she continued. The poem was about cherry blossoms and the passage of seasons themes as old as Japan itself, and as she read, some of the women began to cry quietly. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of hearing their own language, their own culture being honored rather than destroyed by their captors. Keiko reached into the crate and pulled out a slim volume. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a collection of children's stories, the same book she had used to teach reading to her students back in Osaka. She pressed it to her chest and her face crumpled, years of rigid control finally breaking. "I taught these stories," she whispered, "before the war, to children who are probably dead now." Haruka moved to sit beside her, and for the first time since their capture, Keiko allowed herself to be comforted, leaning against Haruka's shoulder as quiet sobs shook her frame. That night, Haruka lay awake again, but this time her thoughts were different. She was beginning to understand something fundamental and disturbing. The Americans were not demons. They were people. People capable of terrible violence. Yes, the bombs falling on Japanese cities proved that beyond doubt, but also capable of unexpected mercy. And that realization was more dangerous to her worldview than any weapon they could have used against her. Late one night, unable to sleep, Haruka sat outside the tent, looking up at the stars. The Pacific sky was clear, the stars brilliant and infinite above her, the same stars that shone over Osaka and over Nebraska and over every place in the world where people looked up and wondered about their place in the universe. Chaplain Miller found her there, making his rounds through the camp as he did every night. He sat down nearby, maintaining a respectful distance, and looked up at the same stars. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. The silence of two people who did not need words to communicate, shared humanity. Then, through Yuki, who had accompanied him, he asked a simple question. "What troubles you tonight, Haruka?" Haruka was surprised to find that she wanted to answer. Over the weeks she had spoken with the chaplain several times, and he had never pressured her, never tried to convert her to his religion, never asked her for information about the Japanese military. He simply listened when she needed to talk, and offered gentle wisdom when she asked for it. "I do not understand," she said finally, the words coming slowly. "We were enemies. We killed many Americans. American bombs killed many Japanese. But you treat us with kindness. You feed us and care for us and give us dignity. Why? We do not deserve this." The chaplain was quiet for a moment before responding, and when he spoke his words were measured and careful. "The Geneva Conventions require that we treat prisoners humanely, but you are right that we could follow those rules without kindness, without going beyond the minimum. So why do we? I think it is because most Americans believe that every person has value regardless of what side they fought on. You were a nurse. You healed people. That work has value, even if it was for the other side. You are a daughter, a sister, a human being. Those things have value too." He paused, then added something that would stay with Haruka for the rest of her life. "War makes us see each other as enemies. But when the shooting stops, we have to remember that we are all human beings. You did not start this war. Neither did I. Neither did most of the soldiers here. We are all caught up in something bigger than ourselves. But we can choose in these small moments to treat each other with humanity. That is what separates us from the darkness." Haruka felt tears on her cheeks, hot against her skin in the cool night air. "In Japan, we were taught that Americans were demons, that you had no honor, no humanity. Everything I see here contradicts that. But if that was a lie, what else were we lied to about? What else did I believe that was not true?" That the chaplain said gently, "is the question that will shape the rest of your life." All of us on both sides were fed lies and exaggerations. Some of what we were told was true. Much of it was false or distorted. The hard work now is figuring out which is which. And that work is painful because it means admitting we were wrong about some very important things. They sat in silence again, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. Finally, Haruka spoke once more, voicing the thought that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "If the enemy values our lives, why did our own leaders not? They told us to die rather than surrender. They called us cowards if we wanted to live. But you, the enemy, you want us to live. You give us food and shelter and hope. What does that mean?" The chaplain's answer came slowly, as if he was choosing each word with great care. "It means perhaps that the greatest weapon any nation can have is not bombs or bullets, but the decision to treat even enemies with dignity. Because kindness, true kindness, is harder to fight than hatred. Hatred is easy. It keeps the world simple. But kindness complicates everything. It demands that we see each other clearly, and once you truly see someone, it becomes much harder to hate them." Haruka understood then what had happened to her in these months of captivity. Every act of unexpected gentleness was a crack in the armor of certainty she had worn since childhood. The tea, the oranges, the books, Frank's photograph of his daughter, the chaplain's patient wisdom. Each small kindness was a question she could not answer. How could the enemy be more merciful than her own leaders had taught her to be to herself? The question had no answer yet. But it was growing, taking root, preparing to bloom into something that would change her forever. The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon in late September. Haruka was working in the aid station when an American soldier was brought in with a severe infection in his leg. The camp doctor was dealing with an emergency in another part of the camp, and Frank the medic was overwhelmed trying to prepare for emergency surgery with supplies that seemed inadequate for the task. He looked at Haruka with desperate eyes and said one of the few Japanese phrases he had learned. "Help me, please." Haruka stared at him, then at the American soldier on the table. The man was young, maybe 20, with fair hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was conscious, but in terrible pain, groaning and thrashing as the infection spread through his system. 6 months ago, Haruka would have felt satisfaction at seeing an American soldier suffer. He was the enemy. He represented the forces that had destroyed her country. But now, looking at him, all she felt was the nurse's instinct to heal. She moved without thinking, washing her hands in the basin, coming to Frank's side. Together they worked to clean the wound, prepare the instruments, administer what pain medication they had available. The soldier grabbed Haruka's hand at one point, squeezing it hard, as Frank debrided the infected tissue, and she squeezed back, murmuring soft words in Japanese that he could not understand, but that seemed to calm him anyway. When the doctor finally arrived and took over, the critical work was already done. The soldier's leg would be saved. As Haruka washed the blood from her hands, watching the pink water swirl down the drain, Frank came up beside her. "Thank you," he said in English. Then, in careful Japanese, "You saved him. You are good nurse, good person." Haruka looked at him, then at her hands still pink with the American soldier's blood. The realization crashed over her like a wave breaking against rocks. She had just saved an enemy soldier's life. Not because she was forced to, not because someone ordered her to, but because it was the right thing to do. Because he was a person in pain, and she was a nurse, and helping people was who she was. The war, the politics, everything she had been taught, none of it had mattered in that moment. Only the human need to heal. She walked out of the aid station and kept walking past the tents, past the guards who nodded at her, with recognition, to the edge of the camp where the fence looked out over the ocean. She stood there for a long time, watching the waves, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. This was the moment. This was where her old self died and something new began. She could no longer pretend that the Americans were monsters. She could no longer believe the lies that had shaped her entire life. She had looked into the eyes of the enemy and seen her own humanity reflected back. She had held an American soldier's hand while he suffered and felt compassion, not hatred. She had worked side by side with American medics and found them to be good people, flawed and human, and trying their best in an impossible situation. The enemy had not broken her with torture. They had broken her with kindness, with respect, with the steady demonstration that everything she had been taught was a lie. And now she stood at the edge of the ocean, feeling the old Haruka, the one who had believed in the emperor and the war and the righteousness of Japan's cause, slip away like sand through her fingers. In her place was someone new, someone who had seen both the worst and the best of humanity, someone who understood that the world was not divided into good and evil, us and them, but was instead a complicated mess of people trying to survive and make sense of impossible circumstances. Someone who had learned that mercy could be more powerful than any weapon, and that the hardest truths to face were the ones that forced you to question everything you thought you knew. The night before they were to depart for repatriation, Chaplain Miller requested to speak with Haruka one last time. They met in the same tent where they had first talked months ago, when she had been terrified and certain she was about to be violated. Now the tent felt familiar, almost comfortable, a place where truth had replaced fear. "I wanted to say goodbye," the chaplain began through Yuki's translation, "and to tell you how much I have admired your strength and courage these past months. You have endured terrible things, yet you have not lost your humanity. You have continued to heal, to help, to grow. That takes extraordinary strength." Haruka felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved my life. Not by giving me food or shelter, though those things mattered, but by showing me that I was still a person worthy of respect, that I still had value even as a prisoner. That gift is something I will carry with me forever." The chaplain smiled gently. "I did very little. You did the real work, opening your mind and heart to difficult truths." He paused, and his expression grew more serious. "I want to tell you something I have not told many people. I had a son, David. He was 22 years old when he died at Iwo Jima 3 months before we met. He wrote me a letter before the battle. In it he said that if he did not survive, he hoped I would remember that the Japanese soldiers he faced were somebody's sons too. That war makes monsters of us all, but we have to choose not to become what the war wants us to be." The chaplain's voice broke slightly. "When I treat Japanese prisoners with kindness, when I offer tea instead of interrogation, I am honoring my son's memory. I am proving that his death did not make me hate, It made me more determined to see the humanity in everyone, even the enemy, especially the enemy. Haruka could not speak. She simply reached across the table and took the old man's hand, and they sat there for a moment. Two people from opposite sides of a terrible war, connected by grief and the choice to respond to that grief with mercy rather than hatred. The chaplain reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. A gift, if you will accept it. No strings attached. You do not have to believe what I believe. But I thought you might want something to remember this time by. Haruka unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden cross, simple and smooth, clearly handmade with care and skill. On the back, carved in neat letters, were the words, "Peace be with you." She stared at it, overwhelmed. In Japan, she had been raised in a mix of Buddhist and Shinto traditions. Christianity was foreign, associated with the West, with the enemy. But this cross did not feel like an enemy symbol. It felt like a reminder of kindness, of the chaplain's patient wisdom, of a time when someone had treated her with dignity when she expected only cruelty. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure this." "Go with God," he said as they stood to leave. "And remember, kindness is never wasted, even when it seems small. The mercy shown to you here, you can show to others. That is how we heal the world. One act of kindness at a time." Before Haruka left the chaplain's tent that final night, she had one more encounter. Keiko was waiting outside in the darkness, her silhouette barely visible against the lantern light of the camp. The hard woman who had screamed about officers' tents on that first terrible day now stood before Haruka with something unfamiliar in her posture. Uncertainty, perhaps even humility. "I was wrong," Keiko said simply, her voice quiet. "About many things. Not about the suffering at home. That is real. But about these Americans. About what mercy means." She paused, searching for words. "You were braver than me, Haruka. You let yourself change. I fought it until I could not fight anymore. Until Red brought us those books, and I saw my students' favorite poems inside. Until Frank showed me his daughter's photograph, and I saw my own son's face in every young soldier's eyes. Until I realized that hating them required more strength than I had left." The two women embraced, and in that embrace was forgiveness for all the harsh words, all the arguments, all the resistance to truth that pride demanded. The next morning, as they prepared to board the trucks that would take them to the ships, Red found Haruka. He pressed something into her hand. A photograph. It showed him and another young soldier, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera with the careless joy of youth. My brother Red said in the careful Japanese he must have practiced for days. "Killed Iwo Jima. I angry at first. Want hate. But you and Michiko and all ladies show me." He struggled for words, then simply tapped his chest over his heart and smiled sadly. "Not enemy. People. Same as my brother. Same as me." He paused, then added in broken Japanese, "You go home now. You tell family. Some American boys good, some bad. Like all people. War make us forget. But you remember. You tell." Frank came last, bringing Michiko with him. The girl who had wept over an orange now carried herself differently, something stronger in her spine. Frank handed Haruka an envelope, his eyes moist behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "For your daughter someday," he said through gestures and broken Japanese. "Tell her about mercy. Tell her about Mother who saved American boy's life. Tell her some things bigger than war." Inside the envelope, Haruka would later discover was a letter explaining everything. Why he had treated Japanese prisoners with such care. How his wife Helen had lost 3 pregnancies before Emma survived. How he had promised God that if his daughter lived, he would show gentleness to every woman he encountered, even enemy women, because they were all somebody's daughters. All somebody's hope for the future. Haruka returned to Japan in December 1945 to a country in ruins, but slowly beginning to rebuild. She found her mother and sister alive, though thin and worn by years of hardship. Her father had died during the war, his untreated illness finally claiming him. She told them carefully, bit by bit, about her experience as a prisoner, and when she showed her mother the wooden cross, her mother held it carefully and said something Haruka would never forget. "The Americans gave you back your life. That is a gift worth remembering." Haruka did remember. She kept the cross on her bedside table for the rest of her life. She kept Frank's letter and Red's photograph. She kept the memory of Chaplain Miller's gentle wisdom and Yuki's patient translation. She kept the taste of that first cup of tea, the smell of oranges, the sound of Michiko reading poetry in their shared tent. She became a midwife as she had dreamed before the war, helping to bring new life into a world that had seen too much death. She married a kind man who had lost a leg in the war, but not his capacity for gentleness. They had 3 children together, and she told them all the stories. Not the sanitized versions, not the simplified narratives of good and evil, but the complicated truth. In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, Haruka received an unexpected letter postmarked from Texas. It was from an organization of American veterans planning a reconciliation ceremony in Okinawa, inviting former Japanese prisoners to attend. Haruka, now 73, with silver in her hair and grandchildren of her own, held the letter in trembling hands. "Should I go?" she asked her daughter. "Will it hurt too much to remember?" Her granddaughter, reading over her shoulder, asked the question that changed everything. "Grandmother, did they really give you tea? Like in your stories?" "Yes," Haruka said softly, "and that tea changed my life." She went. The ceremony was held on a hillside overlooking the ocean where the camp had once stood. Old men and women gathered, some in wheelchairs, others walking with canes, all carrying 50 years of memory in their eyes. The Americans wore caps with unit insignia. The Japanese wore their best clothes and expressions of careful dignity. An old man approached Haruka slowly, his gait uneven, his right leg clearly stiff. He was tall even now, with white hair and a weathered face that suggested decades spent outdoors. When he spoke, it was in broken Japanese that triggered a flood of memory. "You saved my leg. September 1945. Aid station. I never forgot face." Haruka stared at him, recognition dawning like sunrise. The young soldier whose hand she had held, whose blood had washed pink in the basin, whose pain had awakened her nurse's instinct despite everything. They stood looking at each other across 50 years, across 2 languages, across everything that had happened since that September afternoon. And then, without words, they embraced and wept. Other reunions happened around them. Michiko found Red, now white-haired but still with those same freckles, and they spoke in halting English and Japanese about children and grandchildren and lives lived in peace. Keiko met an American teacher who had helped distribute the books, and they discovered a shared love of poetry that transcended the war that had once divided them. That night, alone in her hotel room, Haruka took out the wooden cross Chaplain Miller had given her half a century before. The wood was smooth from decades of handling, the carved words still legible, "Peace be with you." She realized then what the chaplain had known all along. Mercy once received creates a debt, not to the giver, but to the future. A debt paid not with gratitude, but with action. The mercy shown to her had to be passed forward, given to others, multiplied across the years, until the original act became a river rather than a cup of tea. "That is how we heal the world," she whispered to the empty room, remembering his words. "One act of kindness at a time." Years later, when her own children asked her about the war, Haruka would tell them the truth. Not the propaganda version, not the simplified story of heroes and villains, but the complicated truth. That war brought out the worst in people, but it could also reveal unexpected goodness. That the Americans who captured her could have treated her cruelly, but chose mercy instead. That the chaplain's kindness had been more powerful than any weapon because it had forced her to see clearly. "The enemy taught me something our own leaders did not," she would tell them. "That every person has value. That mercy is not weakness. that kindness can change the world one small act at a time. And that is the hardest lesson of all, because it means we must see our enemies as human beings even when they have hurt us, especially then. She would show them the cross, tell them about the tea ceremony, describe the taste of that first orange and the sound of poetry read aloud in a prison camp. She would tell them about Frank and Helen and baby Emma, about Red and his brother, about Keiko's transformation and Michiko's resilience. And she would tell them that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but refusing to let your enemy turn you into something you are not. That the strongest weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that builds. That mercy, even when it is difficult, even when it seems impossible, is always the right choice. Because mercy changes everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about war and humanity and the power of mercy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share true stories from World War II that challenge our assumptions and reveal the complicated truth about one of history's darkest periods. These stories matter. They remind us of our shared humanity even across the deepest divides. Thank you for listening, and remember, kindness is never wasted and mercy changes everything.